Imagine this, you're walking into your home and nothing feels right. There's glass on the floor, furniture knocked over, your wife's car missing, and then you see her in a way you would have never even thought. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is, and what you're doing right now while you're listening. Are you working, driving, lying in bed with the lights off? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing who's out there piecing this together with me. Sherri Rasmussen, the murder by her jealous detective colleague. It looked like just another Tuesday in Van Nuys, a quiet condo tucked behind a security gate, warm Southern California sunlight pouring through the glass. John Ruetten had only been married 3 months, and he was out the door early, like always. His wife, Sherri Rasmussen, had been feeling off, nervous, actually, but she brushed it aside, kissed him goodbye, and told him she'd probably skip work. When he came home that evening, the front door was slightly ajar. Now imagine this, you're walking into your home and nothing feels right. There's glass on the floor, furniture knocked over, your wife's car missing, and then you see her. Sherri, his beautiful, brilliant, fiercely independent wife, she was lying on the living room floor barefoot in her bathrobe. There was blood, a lot of it, and worse, she wasn't breathing. It was total chaos. The first officers on scene marked it as a robbery gone wrong. Glass was shattered from the sliding door upstairs. VCRs and electronics were stacked by the door, like the burglar had been spooked and left in a rush. There was evidence of a struggle, a vase shattered, a lamp overturned, bruising on Sherri's arms, even a bite mark. She had been beaten badly, and then shot, twice in the chest, once in the face. It was brutal, and it didn't make sense. But the narrative quickly set in. LAPD told the family it was likely 2 burglars, said the house looked ransacked, said the missing car, Sherri's BMW, was probably joy-ridden and would turn up soon. And it did, 2 days later, abandoned not far from the condo. Still, something about it didn't sit right. Sherri's dad, Nels Rasmussen, kept saying it wasn't random. She was targeted, he insisted. It wasn't a robbery. But detectives waved him off. Their story was clean. It was a break-in gone bad, they said. No suspects, case cold. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. Sherri had been scared. She'd told her parents that someone had been bothering her. A woman, a cop. She never said her name, but she described the encounters, showing up at her hospital, standing outside her house, confronting her about her new marriage to John. Still, no one put 2 and 2 together. And the most chilling part, that bite mark. The detectives had collected a swab, but in 1986, DNA testing wasn't common. They filed it away, like so many other things in this case, tucked it into a box and moved on. For over 20 years, Sherri's story stayed sealed inside that condo. Cold files, dusty evidence, a grieving husband who remarried, and a father who never stopped asking questions. It would take 2 decades and one bold decision to bring her voice back. You ever hear a detail so strange, so specific, it just lingers in your head? That's what the bite mark was. Even after the LAPD chalked up Sherri's murder to a burglary gone bad, there was this one thing nobody could explain away. A human bite on the inside of her forearm. Think about that for a second. A bite is intimate. It's up close, personal. You don't bite someone in the middle of a chaotic break-in unless something else is going on. But in 1986, they couldn't do much with it. No reliable DNA databases, no CODIS. So the bite got filed under interesting but unhelpful, and the swab was tucked into evidence, just another bag in a cold case box. For years, that bite was a ghost. Every now and then, someone would bring it up, usually Nels Rasmussen, Sherri's father. He begged the detectives to take another look. She was a fighter, he told them. She scratched, she bit back. Whoever did this left a piece of themselves behind. But it didn't matter. They'd made up their minds. Burglary. No suspects. No motive. Case closed. Behind closed doors, though, Sherri's parents were losing sleep, and her sisters started whispering about the woman they'd always felt uneasy around, Stephanie Lazarus, John's ex-girlfriend, a cop, someone who, according to Sherri's own words, had been showing up where she wasn't supposed to be, once at Sherri's work, once outside their condo, and once, allegedly, inside their apartment when John wasn't home. She had borrowed a pair of skis, but she also lingered. No one followed up on any of that. It wasn't until 2004, 18 years later, that technology finally caught up. The LAPD formed a cold case unit and someone dusted off Sherri's file. A young detective noticed that bite mark swab and raised a question. Was there enough DNA left to test? Turns out there was. The results came back. The killer was a woman, and that changed everything. Now imagine being one of the detectives on this case. You've got a 30-something-year-old mystery, a high-profile murder, and now scientific evidence quietly shouting at you from a dusty evidence bag. This wasn't random. You go back to the case files, the crime scene photos, the witness interviews, and suddenly that tidy burglary story starts to fall apart. Electronics left behind, that's not how burglars operate. Too much rage in the scene, too much time spent, and that bite, it wasn't a fight for survival. It was personal, vengeful, intimate. Still, naming names wasn't easy. Not yet. The suspect pool had suddenly shrunk by 90% sure. But who would kill Sherri with that kind of passion? Who hated her enough? Well, if you asked Nels, he'd tell you he'd always had a name in mind. But it took the next few moves to confirm the unthinkable. The killer wasn't just a woman. She was one of their own. So here's where the story turns from tragic to just plain surreal. Picture this. You're a cold case detective in 2009 looking at the DNA results from a murder that happened when you were still in school. And the sample tells you two things. One, the killer was a woman. And two, she was incredibly close to the victim. This wasn't some random break-in. This was personal, intentional, rage-fueled. So you dig deeper into Sherri Rasmussen's life. Not just her work, but her relationship, her new marriage. You start asking who had reason to hate her. And over, one name quietly resurfaces. A woman named Stephanie Lazarus. Here's the kicker. She's not some vague figure from the past. She's a detective in the same department. Yeah, Stephanie wasn't just any cop. She was highly decorated, worked in the art theft division, and had a solid reputation. She gave lectures, mentored younger officers, smiled in press photos. Her file was clean, no complaints, no suspensions. She'd been promoted steadily, trusted. She even walked the same halls as the detectives reopening the case. And all the while, she had never been officially questioned in connection to Sherri's murder. Not once. But when you go back to 1986, a different picture starts to form. Stephanie had dated John Ruetten on and off through college. By all accounts, she was deeply in love with him, maybe obsessed. And when he broke it off to get serious with Sherri, she didn't take it well. In fact, according to Sherri's family, she didn't take it at all. Sherri had reportedly told her father and friends that Stephanie had shown up at her hospital uninvited, that she confronted her about her relationship with John, that she seemed jealous, maybe even unhinged, and Sherri was worried enough to mention it more than once. At one point, Stephanie even showed up at their apartment while John was gone. She said she was there to return some skis. Let that sink in. The detectives, now fully aware of who Stephanie Lazarus is, know they're walking on a minefield. You don't just walk into another officer's office and say, "Hey, we think you murdered someone 23 years ago." They needed to be smart, quiet, surgical. And they also knew that if Stephanie found out, she could burn everything before they had a chance to prove anything. Evidence, notes, diaries. Who knew what she still had, or what she might do to cover her tracks? So they did the unthinkable. They started investigating their own colleague, without her knowing. And the deeper they dug, the more cracks they found. Stephanie's calm, professional exterior, it was a mask. Underneath, there was age, obsession, a history that hadn't been erased. It had just been ignored. The truth was right there, walking the halls of the LAPD, smiling, working cases, wearing a badge. The question now wasn't if she did it, it was how to prove it without tipping her off. By this point, the detectives working the cold case were deep in something they couldn't say out loud. A slow, methodical investigation of one of their own, a veteran LAPD officer. And they weren't just chasing a hunch, they were chasing a motive that had been screaming at them from between the lines since day one. The motive was love, or maybe obsession. See, back in the early 1980s, Stephanie Lazarus and John Ruetten were college sweethearts at UCLA. They were both smart, athletic, and ambitious. She was even on the women's basketball team. But while John was moving on, trying to build a life, Stephanie was still caught in it. The off-and-on dynamic they had, it never really turned off for her. John met Sherri Rasmussen in 1984. She was tall, warm, confident, an ICU nurse who'd already made a name for herself in her field. They clicked almost immediately. Within a year, they were engaged, and that's when things started to go dark. Stephanie didn't take the news well. According to Sherri's family, she began showing up unannounced at their apartment, at Sherri's workplace, even at their gym. Sherri told her parents she felt stalked. She said Stephanie had once confronted her face to face, saying, "If I can't have John, nobody else will." And here's the thing, John, in hindsight, admits he didn't fully grasp how intense it was. He thought they had ended things on friendly terms, but when pressed, he later confessed something else. In the weeks leading up to his wedding, he slept with Stephanie. Just once, he said, a closure kind of thing. But for someone already spiraling, that wasn't closure, that was gasoline. Stephanie wrote in her journals around that time, rants and raw emotional entries about being betrayed, feeling used, obsessing over John. She poured herself into work, but the jealousy didn't fade. She watched him build a life with someone else, a life she thought should have been hers. And then, on the morning of February 24th, 1986, just months into John and Sherri's marriage, Sherri stayed home from work. She was alone, vulnerable, and by the time John got home that evening, she was dead. At the time, LAPD never seriously questioned Stephanie. They never considered the possibility that one of their own, driven by heartbreak, could snap. But now, in 2009, the cold case team was reading those journal entries, studying her calendar, mapping out her movements, and one thing became clear. Stephanie had motive, she had access, and she had rage. It wasn't a random burglary, it was a love triangle gone toxic. The only thing left was to prove it, without her ever seeing it coming. This is the part that hurts the most, because it didn't have to take 23 years. Sherri Rasmussen's murder wasn't just tragic, it was mishandled. From the very beginning, the LAPD framed the crime as a home invasion gone wrong. They had tunnel vision. 2 burglars, they said, probably Latino gang members. Random violence. Sherri just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But let's really sit with that for a second. Sherri was 29 years old, a rising star in the nursing world, already a director of critical care at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. She was smart, respected, she believed in helping people. And when she was murdered, beaten, bitten, shot in her own living room, the investigation around her death was sloppy, dismissive, rushed. Her father, Nels Rasmussen, tried to speak up. He told detectives about Stephanie Lazarus, about the weird run-ins, the jealousy, the harassment. He gave them a name, a motive, a trail. But they told him he was watching too many crime shows. They said there was no evidence, just grief talking. And so, for over 2 decades, Sherri's story sat in a cold case file. It was like she vanished. Her name faded from headlines. Her family carried the grief alone. Every anniversary, her father sent letters to the LAPD begging them to reopen the case. He kept track of officers, updates, promises broken. He never let it go. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus was thriving. She got married, had a daughter, rose through the ranks in the LAPD. She worked art theft, handling high-end heists, attending galas, posing as a champion of justice. She was even interviewed on local news segments about stolen paintings and cultural artifacts. She smiled into cameras. All the while, Sherri was 6 feet under, and her killer was shaking hands with the press. By the mid-2000s, DNA technology had caught up to the evidence. Cold case units were being formed across the country. In Los Angeles, a small group of detectives began revisiting old files. One of them opened the Rasmussen case. They looked past the burglary story, past the flawed first assumptions, and they saw it. The bite mark. It was still there, bagged, swabbed, preserved, and when they ran it through the system, it didn't match any known criminal in the national database, but it came back female. Suddenly the burglary story fell apart. No burglar stops mid-robbery to bite someone. No burglar fights long enough to leave that kind of scene. The evidence of rage, of hatred, of personal vendetta, it was screaming from the photos, the reports, the body. The detectives knew what they were looking at now. A staged crime scene. A murder disguised as a break-in. And the original investigators, either they missed it or they buried it. Either way, the truth was finally waking up. And the woman who'd eluded justice for decades, she had no idea they were coming. In 2009, a pair of cold case detectives at LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division sat in a quiet room with a box that hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, crime scene photos, a bite mark swab, and the yellowed reports from a murder so cold it had frost on its paperwork. Sherri Rasmussen. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to reopen a wound the department had quietly let scab over for 23 years, and it was going to bleed all over the LAPD's badge. First, they reviewed the crime scene. The burglary didn't make sense. Electronics stacked at the door, untouched. The sliding glass door broken from the inside out, and Sherri's wounds, savage. This wasn't a panicked thief. This was someone who hated her. Then came the turning point, the DNA, that bite mark. After all this time, it still held a secret, a profile, and when they ran it, bam! Not a hit in the criminal system, but it was female. That was huge. Because back in 1986, they were looking for 2 male gang members, a completely different story. The case suddenly snapped into focus. The detectives pulled the original interviews, names mentioned, tips ignored, hunches dismissed, and there. It was Stephanie Lazarus, mentioned by Sherri's father, a woman who had been romantically involved with Sherri's husband, a woman who had shown up at Sherri's workplace, a woman who'd once entered their apartment, alone, and she was LAPD, still working in the building, still wearing the badge. The room got real quiet after that. See, it's one thing to chase a cold lead, it's another thing entirely when the suspect is sitting a few desks away. Lazarus had rank, friends, a reputation. She was on the art theft detail, low stress, high profile, the kind of place you put trusted veterans. The cold case team had to move carefully. No phone calls, no whispers. Every step had to be confidential. They couldn't risk tipping her off, not even accidentally. If Lazarus caught wind, she could destroy evidence, lawyer up, or worse, walk away clean. They built the case silently. They mapped out Lazarus's life, interviewed old coworkers, dug through storage. They subpoenaed her personnel records. Nothing flagged, no disciplinary marks, no red flags. But rage doesn't leave paperwork, so they made a decision. They needed her DNA, but they couldn't just ask for it. They had to take it, without her knowing. That's when the operation shifted from investigation to surveillance. They followed her discreetly, watched her routines, and one day, in a Costco food court in Simi Valley, they got their break. She tossed a drink cup, they collected it, tested it, and when the results came back, it matched the DNA from the bite mark. No doubt, no maybe, they had her. Now they had to bring her in, and fast. It all came down to a paper straw. After weeks of quiet surveillance, the cold case team finally spotted Stephanie Lazarus out in public. She wasn't working a case, she wasn't doing anything suspicious, she was just being a mom shopping at Costco in Simi Valley. But for the detectives tailing her, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. They had one job: get her DNA without her knowing, no warrant, no confrontation, just a discarded object, anything she'd touched with her mouth. The easiest way? Wait for her to eat or drink, and then pounce. So they watched from a distance as she sat down at a food court table and sipped a soda, totally unaware, just a regular afternoon. When she got up to leave, she tossed the cup and straw into a trash can. And that's when the operation kicked into high gear. The detectives moved in, gloved hands, evidence bags, quiet urgency. They pulled the cup out of the trash like it was gold. And in a way, it was. That straw held Stephanie Lazarus's DNA. 23 years after Sherri Rasmussen was murdered, the case was about to either break wide open or collapse entirely. If the DNA didn't match, that would be it. The cold case would go cold again, but if it did, they'd have a killer. The sample went to the lab, and those few days of waiting were unbearable. The detectives didn't talk much. Nobody wanted to jinx it. All they could do was keep reading over the files. Sherri's photos, the bite mark analysis, the statements from her grieving father that had been ignored for so long. Then the call came in. Match. The bite mark DNA recovered from Sherri's arm in 1986 matched the saliva on Stephanie Lazarus's discarded straw. It was her. That changed everything. Now, LAPD had a serious problem on their hands. Not just a killer in their ranks, but a killer who'd worn the badge for over 2 decades, who'd worked cases, handled evidence, arrested suspects, who could have at any point destroyed what little proof was left of her own crime. They had to act fast, but they also had to act smart, so they set a trap. They called Lazarus into an interview room under the pretense of getting her input on a case. Something routine, something that wouldn't raise alarms. She walked in, cool as ever, unarmed, relaxed. It was just another day at work. And then the questions started. Casual at first. "Hey, remember that girl John married? Sherri Rasmussen?" She paused, blinked, tried to act surprised. "Wow, that was a long time ago." But as the questions got sharper, her body language shifted. Fingers clenched. Breathing changed. Her mask started to crack. What she didn't know, the room was wired. The detectives were recording everything, and outside that room, officers were preparing an arrest warrant. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't walking out of that building. Not this time. By the time the interview ended, Stephanie Lazarus knew. She tried to stay composed, but you could see it, the shift, the shallow breaths, the stalling, the way she repeated questions back, buying time. The moment she realized this wasn't a casual chat, it was an ambush, and it was closing in. She asked to leave. Too late. Outside the room, detectives were already in motion. The moment she stepped out, she was arrested, handcuffed. No badge, no gun, just a stunned, silent walk through the halls she had worked in for 26 years, now surrounded by people who no longer looked at her as a colleague, but as a suspect. The charges? First-degree murder, cold-blooded, premeditated, personal, and the fallout was immediate. A search warrant was executed on her home, not just for evidence, but for any trace of the past she might have kept. Letters, photos, clothing, diaries, anything that could connect her back to Sherri Rasmussen in 1986. What they found wasn't just physical, it was emotional. In the closet, mementos from her college days with John Ruetten, old photos, love notes, keepsakes from a relationship that had ended long ago, but had clearly never ended for her. In a box, they found a journal, handwritten entries filled with anger, heartbreak, obsession, some written before the murder, some after. One entry read, "I hate that he chose her. I hate that she won." Another, "She doesn't deserve what she has." These weren't just emotional scars, they were roadmaps. The prosecution now had motive, opportunity, and a direct emotional thread tying Stephanie Lazarus to the victim. But they needed to be careful, because this wasn't a typical case. They were going up against a police officer, a career detective, someone who knew procedure, who could poke holes in sloppy work, who might even still have allies in the department. There was also the issue of credibility. How could a case go unsolved for over 2 decades, with so many obvious signs, and not look like a cover-up? Sherri's family had been saying it all along. Stephanie did it. But for 23 years no one listened. Now the city, and the nation, was listening. The press got hold of the story. Cop charged in 1986 cold case, murder. The headlines were everywhere. And at the center of it all, John Ruetten. He had moved on, remarried, started over. But now the past was clawing its way back. Detectives re-interviewed him. He admitted something he hadn't shared in 1986, that he and Stephanie had slept together one last time after he was engaged to Sherri. He thought it meant nothing, but to Stephanie it had meant everything. Everything she thought she lost, and everything she thought she could take back. The question now wasn't whether Stephanie Lazarus did it. The question was whether the justice system, her system, would finally hold her accountable. Stephanie Lazarus sat quietly in court, no longer a respected LAPD detective, but a murder suspect on trial. The room was tense. Cameras rolled. Sherri Rasmussen's family watched, silent but resolute. The prosecution laid out the motive. A jealous ex-lover, spurned by rejection, enraged by the life John Ruetten built with someone else. The bite mark DNA was the star, but so were Stephanie's own words, journal entries full of fixation and resentment. One read, "I hate that she won." Then came John. He took the stand and admitted he'd slept with Stephanie once after getting engaged to Sherri. It was a moment he thought meant nothing. But to Stephanie, it was everything. The defense called it all circumstantial. They tried to revive the old burglary theory, but it didn't hold. The rage, the precision, the cover-up, it pointed to someone who knew how to stage a scene. In March 2012, the jury returned after just 2 days. Guilty. Stephanie was sentenced to 27 years to life. But justice came too late for Sherri, and the LAPD had to reckon with a truth even harder to swallow. For 23 years, they had a killer walking their halls. For a while, it seemed like the story was over. Stephanie Lazarus was behind bars, serving 27 years to life at the California Institution for Women. The headlines faded. The courtroom buzz died down, but the families didn't forget. And in 2023, 11 years after her conviction, Stephanie was up for parole. And that's when things took a turn no one expected. At her parole hearing, for the first time ever, Lazarus spoke, not in vague denials, not through a lawyer, but clearly, deliberately, and with what some described as measured regret. She admitted she killed Sherri Rasmussen. She didn't say why, not exactly, but she confirmed it was deliberate, that she had gone to the condo, that she had confronted Sherri, that she had bound her, fought her, and shot her. 3 rounds, 1 in the face. She didn't cry, but she called it the biggest mistake of my life. The parole board almost bought it. Almost. But in 2024, they rescinded their initial recommendation for release after strong public backlash and further review of her statements. Prosecutors and victims' advocates argued it wasn't a true confession. It was calculated, a performance. One more attempt to control the narrative. Stephanie will be eligible again in 2028, but for Sherri's family, the damage was done long ago. She finally said the words, Nels Rasmussen told a reporter, but it's not justice, it's survival. And maybe that's what this case really is. Not closure, but the long, exhausting fight to keep the truth from disappearing. Story 2, The Sniper Who Wasn't a Terrorist. September 1st, 2015, Fox Lake, Illinois. The radio call came in at 7:52 a.m. sharp. Suspicious individuals, black clothing, northbound near the cement plant. Lieutenant Charles Joseph Glinovich, known around town as G.I. Joe, was already in his squad car. A 30-year veteran of the Fox Lake Police Department, Glinovich wasn't just any cop. He was the guy in parades, the one who saluted the flag like it owed him rent. The one kids looked up to, especially those in his Police Explorer youth program. To the town of Fox Lake, he was the beating heart of the badge. And on that warm September morning, the radio crackled with tension. He responded immediately, saying he was checking it out. Minutes later, a follow-up transmission. I'm in foot pursuit. Then, silence. When backup arrived, they found his squad car empty, the door open, the radio still on. They spread out fast, through the brush, down the gravel path behind the cement plant, into a nearby swampy area thick with cattails and mosquito fog. And then, just before 8:15 a.m., they found him, face down in the mud, blood soaking through his uniform, gun by his side. He was dead, shot twice, once in the chest, once in the side. His body was bruised, scraped. His pepper spray and baton were scattered, glasses shattered. It looked like a struggle had happened in the tall grass, a final stand, the kind cops whisper about at funerals. By 9:00 a.m., a perimeter was up, and by noon, Fox Lake was on lockdown. Helicopters swarmed the skies. Over 400 law enforcement officers from 50 agencies flooded the area, roads closed, schools shut down. Tactical teams pushed through the woods, searching for 3 suspects, allegedly 2 white males and 1 black male. As relayed in the first radio description, the manhunt was intense, emotional. People believed they were chasing cop killers. Within hours, Glinovich was hailed as a hero who died defending his community. News stations blasted the headlines. Fox Lake officer ambushed and killed. Blue ribbons tied to street signs. Crowds gathered at candlelight vigils. Children placed flowers on his squad car. His nickname, G.I. Joe, trended nationwide. No one questioned it. Not yet. Because why would they? He was one of the good guys, a symbol, a protector. But behind the scenes, some of the responding officers already felt it. The scene was off. Something about it didn't sit right. The positioning of the gear, the trajectory of the bullets, the absence of any real trail, no eyewitnesses, no video, no real suspects. Still, no one said it out loud. Because you don't doubt a dead cop, especially not one like G.I. Joe. The town needed a martyr, and that's exactly what they thought they had. For nearly 48 hours, the town of Fox Lake transformed into a war zone. Sirens screamed around the clock. Helicopters hovered overhead, circling the muddy wetlands and wooded neighborhoods like hawks. Tactical units in full armor patrolled the streets, rifles up, scanning every shadow. Local businesses shut down, schools closed. Residents were told to shelter in place while law enforcement combed the area in what quickly became one of the largest manhunts Illinois had seen in years. All of it for 3 men who didn't exist, but no one knew that yet. The staged crime scene raised eyebrows. But the digital trail? That blew the whole thing wide open. Once investigators started peeling back the layers of Lieutenant Glinovich's personal and professional life, they knew they'd have to look at his phone. They pulled it from evidence and began downloading the contents. Texts, emails, deleted messages, everything. What they found? Over 6,500 text messages and 40,000 emails, some deleted, some encrypted, many frantic. And they weren't about patrol shifts or department memos. They were about money, about panic, about getting caught. One text stood out immediately. It was sent to a woman only identified by investigators as individual number 1, someone Glinovich had worked closely with. It read, "If she gets a hold of the old checking account, I'm pretty well Ed." She was referring to Anne Marin, the newly appointed village administrator. She had started auditing the department's finances, and that included the Fox Lake Police Explorer Program, a youth mentorship initiative run by none other than G.I. Joe himself. Marin was just doing her job, but to Joe, she was a threat, a ticking clock, because somewhere inside those accounts were secrets. Investigators found more texts. There may be an issue with the deposit into the Explorer account. She's getting close to something. I need to figure out a way to cover the rest of that money. The texts weren't just desperate, they were incriminating, and they started to outline a second life. A man everyone saw as a hero had been embezzling money from a children's program, not for equipment, not for the kids, for himself. Investigators traced Explorer funds used for personal gym memberships, vacations, mortgage payments, and even adult websites. Tens of thousands of dollars gone, and the paper trail was finally catching up. Now it made sense. The pursuit, the ambush, the Frau, panic radio call, none of it was real. It was all part of a final act, one last attempt to escape the consequences by leaving behind a hero's legacy instead of a criminal charge. And this wasn't just shame, this was premeditated. He had sent goodbye messages, deleted files, shuffled accounts. He had carefully planned the timing of his staged death for just before a financial review. So why did no one see it coming? Simple. Because no one wants to believe the guy in the uniform, the guy mentoring kids, raising flags, serving coffee at community breakfasts, is secretly laundering money and staging his own murder. But now the evidence was mounting, and behind closed doors the team faced a hard truth. Lieutenant Charles G.I. Joe Glinovich wasn't a fallen hero. He was a fraud with a badge, and the next revelation would take it to an even darker place. As the days wore on and the manhunt cooled, investigators turned inward to the evidence that wasn't adding up. And at the center of that mess was a forensic headache no one wanted to talk about publicly yet: the ballistics. Glinovich had been shot twice. One bullet went through his protective vest into his chest. The other grazed his lower abdomen. A third bullet lodged in the ground near his body. It had apparently gone through his cell phone. But here's the weird part. All 3 bullets were fired from his own gun. That raised eyebrows, because it meant either he'd been disarmed by his attackers and shot with his own weapon, or something else had happened. Investigators started doing what they do best: mapping trajectory. They reconstructed the scene in meticulous detail, where the body was, the angles of entry, the distances involved. And the more they ran the numbers, the more the whole struggle with suspects scenario began to wobble. For one, the shot through his chest was downward, suggesting he may have been kneeling or leaning forward. And the bullet that shattered his phone? Fired at a range inconsistent with the chaos of a real firefight. Then came the bruising. Glinovich had small abrasions, scratches, minor bruises, nothing major. At first, it looked like signs of a struggle, but the medical examiner raised a question. Why weren't the injuries more severe if three men had supposedly overpowered a trained officer in a muddy brawl? And then there were the items scattered at the scene. His baton, handcuffs, and pepper spray were oddly spaced. Not as if they'd been dropped mid-combat, but more like placed in a sequence, like props in a story someone was trying to sell. Even his glasses were sitting face up in the grass. But the most chilling clue? No defensive wounds, nothing under the fingernails, no broken skin, no mud-slicked punches, just a clean uniform, blood seeping out through small, precise holes. So now the question became unbearable. What if there were never any suspects? What if this entire crime scene was a performance, a stage? Built to sell a narrative no one wanted to question, especially when it ended with a uniformed cop in a flag-draped casket. But if it was staged, why? What would make a career officer, beloved by his community, fake his own murder? Investigators didn't know yet, but they did know one thing. If the scene was fake, then everything else, every news story, every manhunt, every moment of national outrage was built on a lie. And that meant it was time to start digging into who G.I. Joe really was. Not the guy in the parades. The guy behind the curtain. It was the kind of program you brag about in small towns. The Fox Lake Police Explorer Post 300, founded by Glinievich himself, was a community badge of honor, a youth mentorship program that taught teens discipline, service, and law enforcement basics. For years, parents trusted it. Kids wore the uniforms with pride, and G.I. Joe was the face of it all. He coached them, led them on camping trips, taught them how to march in parades. What no one knew was that behind the loyalty speeches and military drills, the Explorer program was also Glinovich's personal ATM. As investigators began digging into the unit's finances, things unraveled fast. Funds earmarked for uniforms and scholarships had been rerouted, quietly and repeatedly, for personal expenses, vacation charges, adult entertainment, hundreds on health club memberships, payments toward his mortgage, even cash withdrawals at bars and restaurants. And the deeper they looked, the longer the list got. It wasn't just a slip-up. It was years of theft, tens of thousands of dollars, systematically drained from an account meant for teenagers who trusted him. Worse, some of the theft had been covered up by creative accounting. Glinievich had shifted deposits between multiple bank accounts tied to the Explorers, occasionally repaying small amounts to avoid suspicion. He even forged signatures and falsified budget memos to give the illusion of normalcy. But as the new village administrator, Anne Marin, began pressing for a deeper audit, the walls closed in, and he knew it. That's why his texts turned frantic in the weeks leading up to his death. That's why he sent vague warnings to his co-conspirators. Yes, there were others, including a woman identified later as his confidant. That's why just days before his suicide he began deleting emails and shredding paperwork at the police station, because it wasn't just money laundering anymore. It was a career collapsing in slow motion, and that final radio call, it was his escape hatch. Die a criminal or die a hero. He chose the latter, and for a brief, intense moment, it worked. Fox Lake grieved like they'd lost a soldier. Politicians gave speeches. Streets were renamed. Donations poured in. No one knew the truth, not yet. But it was coming, and with it, a betrayal that would gut the entire town. Because this wasn't just about money, it was about trust. And the man who had spent 3 decades earning it had sold it for a gym membership and a lie. If there's one thing Glinievich was good at, aside from charming a room, it was staging a scene. And this time he wasn't just cleaning up after a crime, he was the crime. Investigators now had enough to reframe everything they once believed about September 1st, 2015. The manhunt, the radio call, the pursuit. None of it was real. It was all choreography. Because that morning, Glinovich didn't stumble into danger. He walked into it alone with a plan. According to the forensics team, he entered the wooded area behind the abandoned cement plant before sunrise. No suspects ever followed. There were no footprints, no tire tracks. Just Joe, methodically placing items along a rough trail. His pepper spray, his baton, his shattered glasses, laid out like breadcrumbs. The radio call, 3 suspicious males, foot pursuit, was the hook. It bought him time and ensured backup wouldn't arrive too soon. Then he took out his own service weapon and fired the first shot into his chest. That round passed through his ballistic vest, just enough to wound. Then he turned the gun on himself again, the fatal shot. He fell forward, right into the lie. But it wasn't random, and it wasn't impulsive. It was practiced. He'd rehearsed this. Days earlier, Glinovich had cleared out his office. He'd deleted files from the Explorer account. He sent texts that read like goodbyes, masked as jokes. He even warned a colleague to keep their head down, because the truth was catching up. The audit was coming. The paper trail had grown too wide to clean up, and the only way out, in his mind, was to turn a life of lies into a final performance of heroism, and for nearly 2 months it worked. The public grieved. The press idolized him. G.I. Joe was hailed as a casualty in a war on law enforcement. His funeral drew thousands, bagpipes, salutes, folded flags handed to his wife. All the while, investigators VUs, ear in the background, piecing it together in silence. They didn't want to believe it either, but evidence doesn't care how you feel. And by the time they released the findings publicly, the betrayal was too big to contain. Fox Lake didn't just lose a cop, they lost the man they thought defined their town. And the rest of the story? It was still hiding in his phone, waiting to be discovered. By now, investigators knew Glinovich hadn't just stolen money or faked a crime scene. He had crossed into even darker territory. Because inside the thousands of recovered texts, amid the panicked messages about audits, transfers, and covering old accounts, there was something even more chilling. He had started planning how to eliminate Anne Marin. You remember Anne, she was the new village administrator who'd launched the financial review of the Police Explorer program. She hadn't accused Joe of anything. She'd just asked for receipts, transparency, a clean audit. And that's when Joe flipped. In one message to a close associate, he floated the idea of hiring someone to take her out. Another text hinted at planting something on her, fabricating a criminal charge to get her fired or arrested. It wasn't idle venting. He was actively plotting. She has to go, he wrote. We have to figure something out before she finds the transfers. Let that sink in. A respected police officer, decorated, saluted, adored, was considering murder to protect his scam. When investigators saw those messages, they froze. This wasn't just financial fraud anymore, it was conspiracy. The associate he messaged, believed to be a civilian tied closely to the Explorer program, responded in kind. There were no attempts to talk him down. No, Joe, calm down. Instead, the texts show back-and-forth discussions, brainstorming, even cautious encouragement. One even joked about finding someone who could handle it. It's not clear how far the plan got. There's no record of payments, no names of would-be hitmen. But the intent? Crystal clear. Joe Glinovich wasn't spiraling. He was calculating. Every move leading up to his suicide was aimed at controlling the narrative. If he couldn't stop the audit, he'd erase the auditor. If he couldn't explain the missing funds, he'd erase himself. And not as a coward, but as a symbol. He didn't want to be remembered as the guy who stole money from a youth program. He wanted to be remembered as a martyr. And if he had to lie, manipulate, or even kill to preserve that image, he would have done it. In the end, Anne Marin was never harmed. She continued her audit. She gave her statement, but she never forgot the moment she found out, after Glinovich's death, that she had been marked. "I was just doing my job," she later said. "He was the one with something to hide." By the time the public learned about the hitman plan, the story had already shifted from tragedy to betrayal, to something far more sinister. And yet, somehow, it still wasn't over. Because as the mask came off, the damage spread. And G.I. Joe's family? They were about to take the heat next. The shift was almost impossible to process. Just weeks before, Lieutenant Charles G.I. Joe Glinovich had been mourned like a war hero. His funeral was broadcast live, bagpipes played, flags flew at half-staff, national news outlets called him another fallen officer in the war on police. Fundraisers poured in, people wore blue ribbons on their chests and R.I.P. G.I. Joe stickers on their bumpers. And now, the same man was being called a con artist, a fraud, a cop who staged his own murder to cover up years of theft from kids. Fox Lake went silent. You could feel the emotional whiplash in the air. One moment, the community was unified in grief. The next, they were swallowing headlines that sounded like satire. Cop embezzled funds, considered a hitman, then faked murder. People were angry. Some refused to believe it. They said the investigation was flawed, a smear campaign, that Joe couldn't have done those things. Others felt used. They had donated, marched, hugged his family. Some residents wrote angry letters demanding their memorial bricks be removed from the police department steps. One man returned his "Back the Blue" yard sign in tears. And the media? They were ruthless. Images of Glinovich saluting the flag were now placed next to expense reports and texts about taking her out. That perfect portrait of a hero, cracked and reprinted under headlines like Hero Cop or Criminal Mastermind. The entire town had been sold a lie. And when the truth came out, it wasn't just about Joe. It was about them, how they'd been manipulated, pulled into a performance, made part of something rotten. And the grief that had felt so pure, now it felt foolish. The statue that had been planned in Joe's honor was canceled. The street that was to be renamed Glinovich Way, reversed. The community center stripped his name from its wall. His badge number, once retired, was quiet. Lie reassigned. But the story wasn't over yet, because behind the stolen money and fake crime scene, investigators began to see signs that this wasn't a one-man job. People had helped him, some knowingly, and next on the list, his own family. When the dust started settling around G.I. Joe's staged suicide, investigators weren't just looking at Charles Glinovich anymore. They were looking at his entire household, because the deeper they dug into the money trail, the more it pointed not just to one man, but to multiple people who may have known exactly what he was doing and helped him do it. At the center of the storm was his wife, Melody Glinovich. Melody had always been seen as the stoic widow, the grieving wife, holding it together at memorials, holding the folded flag at his funeral. But then the emails came out, and the texts, dozens of them. She was listed as an authorized user on the Explorer account cards, and she had allegedly used the funds too, not for the program, for personal spending, just like Joe. Investigators found receipts linking Explorer money to airline tickets, Starbucks runs, gym memberships, and online shopping. Melody had replied to Joe in texts discussing account balances, when to move the money, and even strategizing about hiding the funds during the audit. It wasn't just passive awareness. It looked like active participation. In 2016, she was indicted on felony charges, money laundering and dispersing charitable funds without authority. Her legal team pushed back hard. They argued that she was simply a wife helping her husband manage finances, that she didn't know the funds were being misused, that none of this would have happened if Joe hadn't taken his life and dragged her name down with him. But the prosecutors had her texts, her fingerprints on the finances, and that quiet certainty investigators often get when something just doesn't smell right. There were also whispers about Joe's son DJ, who had worked in local government. While he was never charged, his name came up in email chains and flagged account activity, enough to raise eyebrows, even if not enough for handcuffs. The public's grief morphed into suspicion. People started wondering, how much did they know? Was this really just Joe acting alone? Or was this a family system built on lies, stitched together by one man's illusion of control? The case against Melody dragged on for years. She eventually pleaded guilty to a lesser misdemeanor charge in 2021, avoiding jail time but accepting responsibility for misusing charitable funds. She walked free, but the damage was done. The Glinovich name, once revered, was now associated with scandal, betrayal, and shame. And for the town of Fox Lake, it became clear the story hadn't been about a fallen hero. It had been about an empire built on deception. And in the final chapter of this case, the question lingered, can a town ever truly move on when the man they buried in uniform had dressed himself in a lie? Years later, the memory of Charles G.I. Joe Glinovich still hangs over Fox Lake, but not like it used to. The blue ribbons are gone, his name removed from memorials, no more parades, no more tributes, just silence, and an unease no one wants to name. The town had spent over $300,000 chasing ghosts. The suspects he claimed to be chasing didn't exist. Donations poured into his family's hands, and when the truth came out that he'd embezzled funds, staged his own murder, and even plotted to kill an auditor, it broke the town's heart. In 2022, the village settled a lawsuit with his widow, Melody Glinovich, for $1 million. She avoided jail time after pleading to a misdemeanor, but the damage was already done. The name Glinovich no longer meant hero. It meant betrayal. There were no charges for their son, no full public apology from the department, and no closure for a community that once believed they were mourning a fallen warrior. Instead, they were mourning a lie. And the saddest part? He got exactly what he wanted, a hero's funeral, a folded flag, and a town that still can't fully talk about what he left behind. Because you can scrub a name off a wall, but you can't erase the trust he shattered. Story 3, the mystery around Lori Erica Ruff's identity. It was the day after Christmas, 2010, in Longview, Texas, and the driveway was quiet except for the sound of a car engine ticking as it cooled. Inside the vehicle, slumped over the steering wheel, was a 42-year-old woman named Lori Erica Ruff. She had a .38 caliber revolver clutched in her hand and 2 notes in the front seat, one addressed vaguely to whoever finds me, the other to her teenage daughter. Neither note explained anything, not her despair, not her choices, not who she really was. The news spread quickly. Lori Ruff was the estranged wife of Blake Ruff, a man from a prominent East Texas family. She had reportedly struggled with mental health issues in the final years of her life, distancing herself from friends, acting paranoid, sometimes lashing out. She and Blake had separated, and she had recently lost custody of their daughter. The family mourned, but also, quietly, they wondered. Because Lori Ruff had always been odd. She never spoke about her past. Not childhood, not family, nothing. It was like she had dropped into the world at age 20 and started from scratch. Whenever Blake's parents asked about her upbringing, she shut down, deflected, sometimes flat out refused to answer. She had no family photos, no childhood stories, and no one ever came looking for her, ever. Still, no one expected what came next. A few weeks after her death, while helping clean out her belongings, Blake's family came across something strange. A locked, strong box hidden in the back of a closet. It was heavy, scratched, clearly well-traveled. Inside, a nightmare. There were IDs under different names. One of them read Becky Sue Turner, a name none of them had ever heard before. Another set of documents used the name Lori Kennedy. There were scribbled notes about government agencies, weird post-it messages referencing the North Hollywood police, and paperwork that traced back to states she had never even mentioned. It was like finding evidence that your loved one never really existed. And the worst part, none of it explained who she really was. The Social Security number she'd used since 1989 traced back to no childhood records. Her name had no digital trail before she was in her 20s. She didn't exist in any yearbooks. She never applied for high school transcripts. It was like she had been dropped into adult life with a blank slate and just kept walking. Blake and his family turned the evidence over to the authorities. Eventually, even the Social Security Administration got involved because this wasn't just a weird family mystery anymore. It was a case of identity fraud that went deeper than anyone expected, and it would take forensic genealogists, DNA testing, and years of obsessive searching to uncover the truth. But back in that driveway, on that cold December day, all anyone knew was this. There was a woman named Lori Erica Ruff, and everything about her had just been erased. It sat in the back of her closet like a secret with a pulse. The lockbox was old, scratched, dented, almost industrial looking, not the kind of thing you'd use to store jewelry or keepsakes. It had weight, like it had been carried through airports, like it had moved more than once. Blake Ruff, her ex-husband, hadn't seen it before. His parents hadn't either. But there it was, tucked into the shadows of Lori's closet after her death, buried under boxes of shoes and papers no one could make sense of. They had to force it open. Inside, chaos. There were multiple IDs, some in the name Lori Kennedy, others in the name Becky Sue Turner. One license was from Idaho, another from Texas, both issued years apart. There were Social Security documents too, but they didn't track. The numbers were technically valid, but nothing before 1989 matched any public record. Also inside the box, a birth certificate for a child named Becky Sue Turner, issued in Bakersfield, California. She would have been 2 years old in 1971, but according to a quick internet search, Becky Sue had died in a fire that same year. Let that sink in. Lori, whoever she really was, had stolen the identity of a dead toddler to start her adult life. There were also fragments that made even less sense. Scribbled post-it notes with names of law firms, a letter with the word North Hollywood Police scrawled across the top, a few grainy photographs of Lori at different ages. In some, she looked like a teenager. In others, her hair was dyed, her expression cold. To Blake's family, it felt like the beginning of a horror story. This woman had lived in their house, married their son, held their granddaughter, and now it looked like she had no past, or at least not one she was willing to share. Everything in the lockbox felt deliberately placed, like it was meant to be found, or maybe never opened at all. The documents told a story, but one that didn't make sense. In 1988, Becky Sue Turner applied for a Social Security card in Idaho. A year later, she became Lori Kennedy. From there, she built a completely new life, a Texas driver's license, a college degree from the University of Texas at Arlington, a respectable job history, even a marriage certificate. But every piece of that life was built on a foundation of lies. The real Becky Sue Turner had burned to death at 2 years old. She had a gravestone, a family, an obituary. So who was the woman who stole her name, and what was she running from? The box offered no answers, just a paper trail into a void. The only clue, everything Lori created for herself began in 1988, so whatever she was before that, she buried. This is where the story gets haunting. Because once the family found that name, Becky Sue Turner, they did what anyone would do. They Googled it. They expected some dead-end result, maybe a common name with no real leads. But what popped up wasn't just unusual, it was devastating. Becky Sue Turner had died in a house fire in 1971. She was 2 years old, lived in Fife, Washington. Her parents were real, her obituary real, her death documented and heartbreaking. She had no surviving siblings, no adult trail, no way she could have grown up, moved to Texas, and become Lori Erica Ruff, because the real Becky Sue Turner never left that fire. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Whoever Lori really was, she had tracked down Becky's death certificate in 1988, 17 years after the child's death. She had gone to Bakersfield, California, requested the certificate, and used it to apply for a new identity in Idaho. A clever move. Because in those days, the systems didn't talk to each other. States weren't cross-checking birth and death records nationally. So she picked a name from someone who'd never grow up and stepped into it. She became a legal ghost. Using that certificate, she got a social security number as Becky Sue Turner, then applied for an Idaho driver's license. She even rented an apartment under that name for a short while, but then she made a hard pivot, changing everything again. By 1989, she'd switched to the name Lori Kennedy, new social security number, new address in Texas. She was laying bricks for a completely new life, one layer at a time. That switch from Becky to Lori, it was deliberate. It allowed her to distance herself from the dead toddler she had hijacked and finally build something sustainable, something that wouldn't raise red flags if anyone casually Googled her one day. And it worked. She got into college, got a business degree, worked jobs, filed taxes, eventually married into the Ruff family, and gave birth to a daughter. No one knew about the stolen identity, not her professors, not her employers, not even Blake, her husband. But there were clues. Lori had always refused to talk about her past, claimed everyone in her family had died. She said she'd skipped high school and taken a GED. She told Blake her life had been too painful to revisit, and he'd respected that, for a while. But now, standing in front of the open lockbox, her entire history was unraveling like a twisted timeline. It wasn't just a new name, it was a manufactured person. And the worst part? It meant that everything after 1988 was a cover. And before that, she had vanished. Once she became Lori Kennedy, it was like a switch flipped. No more hiding in borrowed names. No more state hopping or paper trails under toddlers who never lived to see kindergarten. She had the documents now, a new social security number, a new name, and more importantly, a plan. And she was about to disappear into Texas like she'd been there all along. In 1989, records show Lori Erica Kennedy establishing residence in the Dallas area. She applied for a Texas driver's license, rented apartments, and even enrolled in community college. A few years later, she transferred to the University of Texas at Arlington, where she earned a degree in business administration in 1997. On paper, she was just another adult student, quiet, determined, kept to herself. But if you were around her, something always felt slightly off. She didn't socialize, didn't date, didn't go to campus events, no roommates, no family visits. Professors said she was competent but intensely private. She never shared stories from high school, never talked about her parents, and offered no background details, nothing. And yet, she built a life anyway. She found work in various administrative roles. She got an apartment in East Texas. She paid her bills on time, and little by little she turned herself into someone believable. The woman who started out as a forged identity in a lockbox, she was now someone who sat at boardroom tables. But that secrecy, it was always there. Even when she started dating Blake Ruff around 2003, she kept her history under lock and key. She told him her parents were dead, said she was an only child. No friends from childhood, no photos, no family heirlooms, just her. At first, Blake didn't question it. He thought maybe she'd had a rough childhood, maybe she was just guarded. But she was beautiful, smart, polite, and Blake came from a family that believed in giving people ace, so they accepted it. In 2004, Lori and Blake eloped. No big ceremony, no family on her side, just a courthouse and a marriage license. Blake's parents had only met her a few times. They thought she was shy. But after the wedding, she pulled even further inward. She would panic if anyone asked about her past, avoided holidays, refused to share even the basics, what high school she attended, where she grew up, what she liked as a kid. She didn't exist before the age of 20, and she made sure no one ever got close enough to ask why. Still, she and Blake built a life. They moved into a quiet East Texas home, tried for kids, faced heartbreak after a string of miscarriages, but eventually they had a daughter in 2008. And for a while, Lori seemed like she was finally settling down, but the truth was always there, just under the surface. She wasn't just hiding from people, she was hiding from herself. By 2004, Lori Kennedy, now in her mid-30s, was firmly entrenched in her new identity. She'd put years between herself and the past. No more Becky Sue Turner, no more scrambling. She had a new name, a degree, a job, and now a man who adored her, Blake Ruff. They met at a Bible study in East Texas. Blake was soft-spoken, kind, and came from a well-known family in Longview. His parents were respected in the community, church-going, family-oriented, the type to welcome anyone with a casserole and warm hug. When Blake brought Lori around, they were polite. She was quiet, shy, almost painfully so, but sweet. Always a little formal, a little stiff. Still, she was kind to their son, so they let it be. Then Blake and Lori eloped. No engagement party, no invitations, no explanation. They got married in a small courthouse ceremony, with no one from her side attending. Blake's family wasn't thrilled, but they supported the marriage. They just assumed Lori was private, maybe had some family wounds she didn't want to revisit. After the wedding, the couple moved into a house on Ruff family land in Leonard, Texas. Rural, isolated, peaceful, perfect for someone like Lori. But soon, cracks started to show. Lori didn't just avoid talking about her past, she refused to. If Blake's mother asked about childhood photos, Lori would freeze. When friends invited them to events, Lori declined. She rarely smiled in pictures. She never used social media. She avoided neighbors. Still, Blake loved her. They wanted a family, but the journey there wasn't easy. Lori had multiple miscarriages. Each one hit her hard. She'd withdraw for weeks, refuse to speak, refuse to eat. The already thin wall between her and the rest of the world seemed to grow taller each time. Then in 2008, they had a daughter. For a brief moment, something softened in Lori. She took photos, she laughed, she held her baby like it was tea. The only real thing she'd ever had. It looked like the past didn't matter anymore, like motherhood had grounded her, given her purpose. But that peace didn't last, because once the baby was born, Lori's behavior became more erratic. She became obsessive, paranoid. She refused to let the baby out of her sight. She insisted on homeschooling, even as an infant. Wouldn't let the Ruff family babysit. Wouldn't let them give gifts. Every interaction was filtered through suspicion, as if they were a threat. And Blake? He was starting to feel like a stranger in his own home. He still didn't know who his wife really was. And the woman who had once been a shy mystery was beginning to unravel. It was supposed to be just another family meal. Blake had convinced Lori to join him at his parents' house for dinner. Something simple. Roast chicken, sweet tea, nothing fancy. Just time together, like families do. And for once, she agreed. But by the end of the evening, something was crystal clear to Blake's mother. Lori wasn't just guarded. She was hiding something deep. Every time someone asked her a casual question, "Where did you go to school?" or "What kind of music did you like growing up?" Lori would freeze for just a second too long. Then she'd give vague, recycled answers. "I was homeschooled. My family's all passed on. We moved around a lot." But there was never any detail, never a memory, no mentions of teachers, old friends, favorite places. No laughs about awkward prom stories or childhood pets. Not even small talk, just blank space. It wasn't just that she didn't want to talk about her past. It was like she didn't have one. Blake's mom noticed it. So did his sisters. That eerie emptiness, like Lori had been born in her 20s and everything before that was classified. After dinner, Blake's mother pulled him aside, quietly, kindly. "Something's not right," she said. "I don't think she's telling the truth about who she is." Blake was defensive. He loved Lori. He knew she was sensitive. He thought maybe she had trauma, something too painful to talk about. He wanted to protect her. But in the back of his mind, that dinner gnawed at him. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Lori had always avoided holiday gatherings, always sat just a little too far from the group, never shared stories, never really connected. She lived like someone in witness protection, smiling politely, never letting anyone close. He remembered how she'd panic when he asked for a copy of her birth certificate, or how she refused to file joint tax returns even after they married. At the time, he'd brushed it off. Everyone had quirks. Now he was starting to wonder if hers were deliberate. By 2010, the tension had grown too much. Lori's behavior was increasingly erratic. She was angry all the time, paranoid. She accused Blake's family of spying on her. She kept journals full of cryptic writing. She barely slept, and Blake couldn't take it anymore. He moved out. Lori's world began to collapse. She lost custody of their daughter. She started showing up unannounced at his parents' house, sometimes screaming, sometimes with the child in the car. She was unraveling, and still, nobody knew her real name, not her husband, not her daughter, not anyone. Only Lori knew who she was, and soon she'd take that secret with her. By late 2010, the walls were closing in. Lori Ruff, if that was even her name, had spent more than 2 decades building a life from scratch, piece by piece, brick by brick, but now everything was coming apart. Blake had moved out. He couldn't take the isolation, the paranoia, the way every conversation turned into an accusation. Lori had once been shy and quiet, but now she was guarded to the point of volatility. And when she lost custody of their daughter, something inside her snapped. She spiraled into full lockdown mode. She stopped eating. Her weight dropped. She slept during the day, stayed up all night pacing and writing in thick, spiral-bound notebooks full of scrawled words and chaotic entries. Pages and pages of cryptic language, angry rants, fragmented thoughts about people following her and controlling her mind. Therapy didn't help. Medication didn't help. Her paranoia bloomed. She started sending disturbing emails to Blake's family, accusations, threats, declarations of war. At one point, she drove to the Ruff family home with her toddler in the back seat, pounding on the door, screaming incoherent things. They called the police. But even then, she didn't say who she really was. She couldn't. Because by that point, the lie wasn't just about her name. It was her entire existence. Lori Kennedy, Lori Ruff, Becky Sue Turner, none of them were real. Just masks stitched together with paperwork and silence. She had become so tangled in the lie that there was no version of herself to fall back into. And then came Christmas Eve. On December 24th, 2010, Lori pulled her car into the Ruff family driveway in Longview. She sat there for a long time, the engine ticking, the air cold. She had a .38 caliber revolver with her and two envelopes, one addressed to her daughter, one to whoever found her. She took her life in the front seat. No one was home when it happened. What? And the Ruffs returned later that day. They found her car, found her body, found the notes. And still, no answers. The letters were rambling, emotional. One was described as incoherent. There were no explanations, no apologies, no mention of her real name, no explanation of the lies, just a final act of collapse. The shock rippled through the family, through the small community, through everyone who had ever spoken to her and assumed she was who she said she was. Blake grieved, so did his parents. But beneath the sorrow was something colder. What had she been running from? And more urgently, who had they really let into their lives? Because now it was clear. Lori Ruff didn't just die by suicide. She vanished twice. First, when she erased her past, and again when she took the answers with her. When the autopsy was complete and the shock had settled just enough to let reality in, law enforcement ran into a strange wall. They couldn't find Lori Ruff's past, because she didn't have one. No medical history before the late 80s, no high school records, no parents, no yearbooks, no social security traces before her early 20s. The woman buried in the Longview Cemetery had no childhood on file anywhere in the United States. So officials did what they do when someone has no name. They labeled her a Jane Doe. That was the moment the case shifted from a private tragedy into a national mystery. The family turned the contents of Lori's lockbox over to authorities. Forged documents, the dead girl's birth certificate, the timeline of fake IDs. It all pointed to one thing. Lori had orchestrated her own adult identity in a way that evaded detection for over 20 years. And still, no idea who she really was. That's when the Social Security Administration called in a bulldog, Joe Velling, a former SSA investigator with a reputation for chasing down ghosts. When Velling read the reports, he knew immediately this wasn't amateur fraud. This was something more polished, more practiced, a long game. So he did something unusual. He reached out to the media. In 2013, the Seattle Times published a feature about the woman who stole a dead child's identity and built a life as someone who never existed. The story lit up forums and Facebook groups. Web sleuths from all over the country started digging. They pored over old missing persons cases, high school class photos, genealogy threads, even facial recognition software. But none of it worked, because the key wasn't in public databases. It was in her DNA. That's when Velling turned to Colleen Fitzpatrick, a physicist turned forensic genealogist who specialized in solving identity mysteries using genetic markers. She built a family tree, not from photos or memories, but from Lori's DNA and her daughter's. It took years, every branch carefully researched, every genetic line compared. The goal, isolate Lori's genes from Blake's and trace back the family tree she'd tried so hard to erase. And then, in 2016, a hit. A cousin in Pennsylvania, a family name, Cassidy. Fitzpatrick reached out to the cousin with a photo of Lori. The response? My God, that's Kimberly. For the first time in decades, the mask had a name. The woman buried under the name Lori Erica Ruff was Kimberly Maria McLean, and her story was just about to get even darker. By the time the name Kimberly Maria McLean came to light, the mystery had already consumed years of investigation, hundreds of online sleuths, and the expertise of forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick. It all came down to DNA. Fitzpatrick had taken the genetic data from Lori Ruff's daughter, carefully separating out the paternal side, which belonged to the Ruff family, and focused only on what remained, Laurie's unknown ancestry. She built a profile, chasing down distant cousin matches, building out family trees with painstaking precision, and finally, she found a close hit in Pennsylvania. Fitzpatrick reached out to the family. She didn't offer too many details at first, just a photograph, a headshot of Laurie, clean and composed. The cousin stared at the photo and said quietly, "That's Kimberly." Kimberly Maria McLean had been born in 1968 in Philadelphia, the daughter of a man named James McLean, a prominent local figure. Her mother had remarried in the mid-1980s, and Kimberly hadn't taken it well. At just 18 years old, she packed up her things, left home, and told her family she never wanted to be contacted again. Then she vanished. No forwarding address, no social media, no college enrollment, no contact. Her name never showed up again, until 2010, when she died by suicide under a different name, with a lockbox full of ghosts, and a daughter who never knew where her mother came from. She'd been hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades, but the biggest question still lingered. Why? What could a privileged teenager from Philadelphia have seen or done or feared so deeply that she'd abandon her entire identity and disappear into a fake one? And why, even in death, did she leave no explanation behind? If you found this story as wild and honestly as unsettling as I did, let me know in the comments. Do you want more stories like this? More cases that unravel slowly and leave you questioning everything? And before you scroll, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is, and what you're doing right now. Are you on a late-night rabbit hole, folding laundry, trying to fall asleep with one eye open? I love knowing how these stories find people. And if you're into mysteries that peel back layer after layer, go ahead, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Stick around. There's a lot more coming,